First tells Fox 8 the list of NOPD superintendent candidates is now down to 3 people.
Meg Gatto joins us with more on the semi-finalists on the list. Meg.
Well, Liz and Lauren, current interim NOPD superintendent Michelle Woodfork made the cut, along with the former chief of the Oakland Police Department and the former chief in Henderson, Nevada. Woodfork was appointed interim chief by Mayor Cantrell and has been on the job since December. Ann Kirkpatrick was most recently the chief of the Oakland Police Department. She was fired in 2020 after 3 years for allegedly making false statements about a police raid. She later won a $1.5 million lawsuit settlement for wrongful termination. And Cedric Andres was most recently chief in Henderson, Nevada, but he retired in February after a no-confidence vote last year from the Henderson Police Officers Association. Andres was also cleared of criminal wrongdoing when he fatally shot a man in 2014 while partying off duty in Texas. Dillard University political analyst Robert Collins says that those among applying for the job, this isn't just to be the top cop in New Orleans, but it's really a leadership role. And he questions how the department can have a leader who has blemishes on his or her record.
There's a belief by some members of the public that if you put candidates that have controversial backgrounds, even if they were cleared of any formal charges, against a candidate who might not have a background as controversial. Again, we don't know since the process has not been totally transparent, that the interim superintendent is going to look better.
Dr. Collins says he believes the intention is to have Woodfork be the finalist who Mayor Cantrell will then present to the City Council for approval. Now, Councilwoman Helena Moreno previously said she would not vote to approve any of the semifinalists without more transparency from the Cantrell administration about this entire process. So Liz and Lauren, coming up on Fox 8 News at 5, we explore what will happen if the council does not vote to approve the finalist who is presented to them.
Well, we know it will be heated.
Yes, for sure.
No matter what happens. Thanks, Meg.